morning we're in a 2011 JK. I call it a mid-year JK because the earlier JKs had the old interior with the 3.8 engine. The 12 and ups had the new interior with the Pentastar engine, but the 11 had the old engine with the new interior. So it's kind of a crossover year. In any event, this Jeep has an L86 8-speed. I want to talk about the 8-speed for a minute, then I want to talk about the Jeep. The 8-speed is pretty much getting phased out by GM for the 10-speed. Is it still a viable transmission? Yes. They're getting a little harder to find and a little more scarce as GM pushes the 10-speed, but there's a lot of them out there. GM still does support them new, even though they're on back order. The advantage of the 8-speed is its strength. The 8-speed is an 8L90 versus the 10L80. So that means it's good for about, as I remember, 700 plus foot-pounds of torque. It makes a good candidate for a supercharged engine, a cammed engine, or just a vehicle that you're going to go out and thrash. Remember, most of the transmission failures, in my experience, are from heat, from overheating your transmission. This JK was a pretty typical build, but it took my guys almost as long to deal with the aftermarket accessories as it did to do the build. In fact, I'd venture to say it actually took longer. I wanted to talk about some of the most popular accessories for the JK. Years ago, the S-Pod was a thing to have. It was, I think, an 8-channel. I think there was an 8 and a 6-channel. Essentially, those are the number of relays in the box of things that you can control, whether it was lockers or lights or rock rails or whatever. Since the original S-Pod came out, technology has moved along. The original S-Pod was a rather large metal box mounted above the PCM on the driver's side of the engine compartment. Then they ran some pretty heavy cables along the firewall to the battery, and then of course you had to run your cables all over the place to your accessories. Most of the S-Pods had a switch mount on the header panel above the windshield, and the installation did take quite a while. There was a lot of real estate taken up. It was just an older design. Now of course S-Pod and others have streamlined that. We like the Switch Pros, we like the S-Pod Bantam. There's a whole bunch of them out there. In fact, you can buy them off eBay and whatever. But the new trend is to go to 6, 8 channel, whatever you want. They're about the size of a cigarette box, maybe a little bit bigger, and they mount right on top of your battery. And by doing that, now you have cables that are inches long instead of feet long. Going to solid state electronics means we don't have those big relays and big metal boxes like the old robots. The switch panels have been greatly reduced in size. Some of them are Bluetooth. I call it the credit card mount, and they're pretty much user definable because you can put a locker or a light or whatever logo you want on the switch panel so you know what that's for. We find that these modern switch boxes really clean up the installation, and anything we can do to clean up the installation and reduce the number of wires is always helpful and makes the vehicle more reliable. And some of the old S-Pod installations were just so invasive. I've seen the wires catch on fire. It takes up space in the engine compartment. So if you can, switch over to one of the modern, smaller switch panel units. Air compressors are required in a lot of cases, like if you have air lockers or you want to inflate your tires. The traditional place to mount an air compressor is on top of the brake booster, but again, that's taking up a lot of real estate. The most common is probably the ARB Dual, and the ARB Dual is a good compressor. A lot of guys that don't want to fill their tires up just go with an ARB single there, and there's lots of mounts to put it there. But the ARB Dual is probably what we see the most. What I notice is that it's louder mounted on top of the brake booster right there next to the firewall, because when it fires up, you know it's there. It also gets hot because under the hood gets hot. That reduces the duty cycle of that compressor, especially if you're filling tires. Because if you just have an air locker, it doesn't take very much air to activate that locker. If you're filling a 40-inch tire, that's a lot of load. So the compressor, I've seen them shut down because when they get so hot, they will shut down and need to cool off. So mounting it under the hood is going to reduce that duty cycle. We like to mount them under the passenger seat if possible. There's plenty of mounts out there to do that. We even make our own. I find that it's not only quieter there, but it runs cooler so that the duty cycle goes up. Skids are always a concern. I have guys out there that have never been off-road that have full skids, but if you have full skids, full flat skids, like the Gen Rights and others that are out there, you're doing a couple of things. One, you're trapping the air in, the heat between the body and the skid plate. Make sure your exhaust is wrapped. We do recommend that you vent those skids. Chrysler themselves had a problem with this. In the earlier plate skids, they were finding that debris would blow up in there and then get up against the converter and catch on fire, so they skeletonized their skids. So I think there's a certain amount of protection offered by a skeletonized skid that most of us can deal with. But if you have to have the flat skid and it has to cover front to rear, side to side, make sure that you take the cooling into concern, because you're basically turning that space into an oven. And I've seen the V6s melt fuel tanks where the plastic outer shell just drips off. The inner shell gets a hole in it, and then you start dripping fuel. Most of our four-door conversions, the exhaust system is above the cross member, so you can run pretty much any skid you want. Pretty much everything from the cross member back, you can run a stock skid. The front skid under the engine, we do run the factory engine mounts on the frame, or frame mounts. So that means that the uprights that go to that frame mount may work. When it comes to things like rear cameras, rock lights, rock cameras, I would say the majority of the time they're not installed properly. Most of the installs happen with the body on, so the shop does the best they can trying to route all the wires, but in reality it's pretty messy. And of course we have to deal with that during the conversion, especially if we pull the body off. So if you gotta have rock lights, rock cameras, rear cameras, all that stuff, try to make it as clean as you can. And here's some advice: make a connector like a body connector. If you look at the C300 at the front right side of the engine compartment, down by the lower outlet of the radiator, you will notice that all the electrical, or virtually all the electrical connections between the body and the frame go through that connector. That includes all the ABS wheel speed signals, fuel tank signals, etc. Do the same thing with your chassis. If you have a chassis with all these different lights and cameras and things, make a quick disconnect so the body can be removed without having to cut and hardwire that stuff back. In the engine compartment, we have so many vehicles come in that are just a mess, especially when they have the dual batteries. Cables going everywhere, running across the engine, running across hot exhaust manifolds. It's just common sense. If you have a shop that knows what it's doing, you're not going to see that. You're going to see nicely bundled harnesses that are protected with fire sleeve or split loom or something, and then they're routed where they're kept away from moving parts and hot exhaust. I would venture to say that most of the failures we see are when guys have a radiator hose rubbed through because it's rubbing on the fan strap, or you have a battery dropping right off the exhaust down next to your exhaust manifold and it burns. And that's just common sense stuff again. We have bills where we spend more time sorting that stuff out than we actually do in the V8 conversion. Let's talk about fuel tanks for a minute. I did a video recently on the JK evap system. You might want to check it out. But the bottom line is a lot of you guys want more fuel capacity, or you have a 4-link suspension system, so you have to run a rear-mounted fuel tank. Now, we all know about the GenRight tank, but there's a whole bunch of other ones coming out, copied it or different, and they all have a few things in common. And I want to mention this because the guy says, hey, I want that extra 30-gallon tank in the back, but they don't realize some of the ramifications of that. One, if you're going to have a V8 with a lot of horsepower, we need to beef up the wiring. A lot of these manufacturers will offer you an extension of a small gauge wire, and in some of them, if you have dual tanks, like you have the stock tank and the rear mounted fuel tank, what they do is they give you an extension that goes back to the tank, forward to a switch on your dash, and then back to the tank again. That's a lot of wires to run a fuel pump through. Now there's 4 wires on the sending unit. 2 of them are for the sending unit, which we don't really care about. That's a very low current circuit. But the fuel pump itself, that needs to get proper current and amperage. So what I would recommend doing is, if you're going to extend back to the tank from an original plug, the blue-orange wire I think is about 16, maybe 14 gauge on a stock JK. Bump that up, 12 gauge, 10 gauge, run that back. Because remember, the larger wire you have, the more current you can flow with less resistance. If you are running dual tanks, what I would probably do is run a couple of relays on the fender well, power the fuel pumps directly off the battery, and then have those signals, the fuel pump control signals, trigger those relays. 2, on the fuel tanks, the sending units don't read accurately in most cases. Because these tanks are camel hump tanks, the sending unit can usually read the bottom half of the tank accurately, but it can't read the top half of the tank. So know that. 3, the evap ports are relatively small in these tanks. So the evap system may have a problem with it. You might start throwing some 400 codes. In general, I don't notice that you throw too many 400 codes. What I notice more is guys complaining about trying to fill their tank up. And the way the stock tank works quickly is it has a fill valve, and differential pressure through the filler neck will cause a fill valve to drop, opening a large 5/8 port between the fuel tank and the evap canister. That allows you to push the fuel in quickly. Without that fill valve, you can push the fuel in, but you may not be pushing it in too fast, and you guys that have these tanks know what I'm talking about. Alarm systems. This is probably my biggest peeve. There's a lot of different ways to put an alarm in a JK. Now, all of you probably know that you have a SCIM system, secret key system, but guys want more than that. They want to be able to contact their vehicle. They want two-way feedback, whatever. We see these Viper systems, Fortin systems, CompuServe. Some of them are pretty good. They're plug and play. Like the Fortins I really like because essentially they have a T that goes between the wireless module, which is your security module, and the vehicle. So you just unplug the wireless module, plug this T in, and you're almost ready to go. They give you all the options for the power windows and turning on the parking lights and all that. And at that point, you got to start hacking into the harness. But here's where it all goes south for some of you. You get an old-fashioned alarm system, you hack into the ignition circuits, especially off the ignition switch. The ignition switch is under the steering column in the JK. All the time I see those wires cut to go through an alarm. The alarm fails. They put a push button start system in, whatever. And I can tell you from experience that maybe not the majority, but a high percentage of those alarm systems fail. And when they fail, you need to bypass them to get your vehicle back on the road. So I would be happy if we never see another aftermarket alarm come through the shop. But some of you guys have it. If you're happy with it, it'll probably work the same way after as it works before, because we don't mess with any of those circuits. Aftermarket radios have really come a long way. Now the aftermarket radios are pretty much plug and play in the JK, and they support the CAN bus. So you can monitor engine codes and tire pressure and all that right through your aftermarket radio. Now we did notice in the past that there was some problems with the radios interfacing with the JK. But today that seems to be less. We don't see too much of a problem with it. I really like the Android-based radios because you can put an app on it like Torque and then Bluetooth directly to it and have a virtual dash on your radio. But again, these entertainment systems can cause problems. A lot of them do tap into the CAN bus, and we have seen CAN bus corruption from some of these radios and things like the lockpick. When it comes to interior stuff like CBs, adding seat heaters, iPhone mounts and chargers, that's all up to you. All I can say is do it clean. If there's any wiring involved, make sure you're tapping into a circuit that can handle the load of that device. The cigarette lighter can only do so much. And remember, on the early JKs, the passenger side cigarette lighter is hot all the time, even with the key off. I had a customer in California that had a refrigerator plugged into it, or a cooler, and it ran her battery down, so she switched it over to the other side where it would power down with the vehicle. We have a lot of vehicles come in with suspension problems. They have death wobble, they have torque steer, they have bump steer, they're wobbling all over the road. That's not going to get any better with a V8 unless it's addressed. So try to take it to a reputable shop. In most of our builds, we can run your hydraulic pump, usually a PSC, right in the stock location with the stock hoses. So it's going to work the same way as it did before. We notice some of the hydraulic rams are interfering with the tie rod, or not mounted properly, or the collar is slipping. Moral of the story of the hydraulics and suspension is make sure it's done right. Roof racks and campers. A lot of you guys use your JK for expedition. We don't really have a problem with anything on your roof unless it's somehow attached to the frame or chassis, like to the bumper. If you do, then it's going to make it more difficult to pull the body off. I would say in far more cases, it's the rock rails that are the issue. A lot of you guys weld the rock rails on, which is fine, but remember, for us to get access to pull the body off, it's a lot more difficult when we can't grab the pinch weld and lift the body off. We do have some adapters to go around rock rails, but if you got custom built rock rails and they're welded right to the frame and they extend out and up over the body, that's going to make it difficult for us to get the body off. And in some cases where you have like internal roll cages, we can't take the body off. We got to pull the front core support off and do the conversion through the front. And that takes a lot more time for us because then we got to pull all the wiring and headlights and everything else out. It takes my guys about, well, let's just say less than an hour to get a body off. When it comes to things like hoods and fender liners, our swaps don't really care what you run, but we do have our suggestions. With any kind of a fender liner, make sure it's vented. Back in the early days of the JK, guys were just making solid fender liners, solid sheets of aluminum. You have to have an air gap there for hot air to get out of the engine compartment. The factory Chrysler plastic fender liners had a pretty big opening or gap at the bottom between it and the frame to let that air out. Now I do understand you don't want mud in, but there's a happy compromise. Most of the manufacturers now that made the solid fender liners have switched over to installing a screen or louvering them or whatever. Just make sure those fender liners flow. And in a lot of cases we see guys just take them off, especially the guys that just wheel their Jeeps and they don't really care about that. What they're more concerned about is cooling. As far as hoods go, you can run a cold air hood. In my experience, most of them don't do a whole lot of good. Tire carriers are a pretty big deal for me because when I go off-road, I see some of these 40-inch tires flopping all around in the tailgate. I've seen tailgates damaged because they're not up to holding the weight of that tire. If you're going to have a big heavy tire, make sure you get a bumper mounted tire carrier that can handle the weight of that tire. And remember, when you put that large tire on there, you're probably going to be blocking most of your rear vision, so you might want to put a dedicated rear camera in. I think it was 2016, the feds made it a law that vehicles have rear view cameras, but a lot of our JKs don't. And most radio systems will have a switch input, so you can actually use your radio as a rear view camera. But I actually drove one recently that had a mirror, a rear view mirror that was a rear view camera built into it. So look into those options. When it comes to armor, run anything you want. We don't care. But just remember, full steel armor is going to add hundreds and hundreds of pounds to your JK. I have full steel armor on my 09 Rubicon, and honestly, I've never beat it up to the point that I've needed that armor. I probably would have been better off with aluminum armor or no armor at all. If you calculate how much gas I would have saved over the 100,000 miles that vehicle's been driven, having to haul those hundreds of extra pounds in weight. So base that off of your need. You guys know the shtick about the sacrificial armor, like plastic armor or crushable fenders, versus having a solid steel fender with body protection and all that. Things like antennas, and we know that in some off-roading areas, like up in Sand Hollow, you have to run a tall antenna with a flag on it, and I get Jeeps in like that. Make sure those things are easily removable. Half doors are pretty cool. They can set up some issues in the JK because when you don't have doors that are plugged in to the network and you get out of the vehicle, sometimes the vehicle doesn't know that the driver has exited. You know, when you turn your key off and take it out, the radio's still on, then when you open the door, the radio turns off and the network power's down. I've seen some of these get stuck in a loop. One of the aftermarket things you should install is some beefed up hood latches. If you look at this hood, we're driving into a strong headwind, and it's really, Jeep calls it hood flutter or flapping or whatever you want to call it, but Jeep knows it as hood flutter. My advice is get some good polyurethane hood hold downs like the Daystars. Some guys run those turnbuckles and metal ones, and they're always a pain for me. Never get them on as quick, never get them off as quick. Some of them have keys on them that lock, and if you ever had like an engine fire or something, good luck getting that off. Aftermarket tunes and software. If you've got a Super Chips, a Hypertech, something like that, you might want to disconnect it before you do the conversion. In fact, I recommend you disconnect it or unlock it from your vehicle so that you can save that license. If what you're unlocking is a tuner, like a Super Chips, probably just sell it because you don't need a tune anymore. You don't have that engine. You can get HP tuners or something else for the GM, which, by the way, are a lot easier to tune than the Chryslers. But if you're using like a Super Chips flash cal to set your tire size, unlicense it from the vehicle, have the conversion done, then relicense it. These aftermarket programmers lock to your vehicle based on a VIN number and the calibration that's in your computer. So if the calibration changes during the conversion, it might demand that you get another license to make it work again. Now, if you got a supercharger or a turbocharger, which we've been getting a lot of them in, and you have to have that tuner in it to run it, just send it to us that way, but send us the tuner so that we can unlock it for you. I've had a couple of guys have them tuned by shops, and their controllers were locked, and the shop did not or would not unlock it. So you're kind of screwed in that situation. Guys, you can do anything you want with the lights, but having light bars everywhere really bugs me. On the hood, on the bumper, on the hoop, aiming backwards, aiming sideways, on the A-pillars. And yeah, if you want to be a light bulb, a beacon of a JK, that's fine, but be realistic. You got wiring going all over the place. Do you really need that much light? If you're search and rescue and you need that much light, fine, that's fine. But just remember, the downside to the lights are all that aerodynamic drag, all that extra wiring. And if you happen just to look cool, that might work for you, but I like things that are actually functional. And I can say that I've taken these Jeeps that have lights all over the place, and a lot of them are just redundant. You know, there's pencil beams and fogs and wide and all that. And I turn on one light after another, and I really can't tell the difference because there's just so much light being thrown out there that they're redundant. Remember, your Jeep is like a Swiss Army knife. You want it to do a lot of things. You want to have one of the most capable vehicles off-road possible, but still drive it on the highway and go long distances. And I notice that guys that have tons of stuff, dual batteries and air compressors and electronics everywhere with RF or radio frequencies, and just burden their Jeep down with electrical loads, they're the guys that have more problems. Now, that's not to say if done properly you can't put all the stuff on your Jeep. Just remember, as you pile and pile this stuff on your Jeep, it's going to cause more electrical load. It's going to cause more of an aerodynamic load. You're going to have more weight. We haven't seen a bunch of electrified rock rails come in with the steps, and I actually kind of appreciate that. It does make it easier to get into the taller JKs. This video is getting long. We're going to take this Jeep out to the mountain, and we'll see you next time.